For your eyes only, or for the entire world to hear, U.S. spy chief CIA Director William Burns mentioned China at least 7 times in a recent article published in Foreign Affairs, calling China's rise both a geopolitical challenge and a big long-term threat. Burns revealed that the CIA has more than doubled the percentage of its overall budget focused on China over just the past 2 years. And a China Mission Center has been set up, making China the only country in the world with its own center under the CIA. Burns tells the world that they have stepped up hiring and training Mandarin-speaking spies while stepping up efforts across the world to compete with China. While the Biden administration has advocated a strategy to stabilize relations with China, including cooperating where they could, is this strategy going to work in reality? What does the apparent paradox reveal? And how can China safeguard itself against what some perceive as America's Orwellian surveillance? I'm pleased to be joined from Beijing by Benjamin Norton, Editor-in-Chief of Geopolitical Economy Report, and by Victor Gao, Chair Professor at Suzhou University. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So, Mr. Burns repeatedly mentions China in the article, stating that China remains the only U.S. rival with both the intent and possibly the power to do so. Mr. Gao, that is the premise of the U.S. China strategy under the Biden administration. Is there something wrong with it?
Absolutely. I think Mr. Burns, the CIA and the U.S. government are completely misguided in how to read China. It is true that China's economic development is still pushing ahead. And I would say around 2030, the overall size of the Chinese economy measured by official exchange rate will surpass that of the United States. This is inevitable. On the other hand, China is perfectly happy just to live in peace with the United States, your God for you, my God for me, and we are not going out there to challenge whatever the United States is. However, the United States seems very eager to view China in a hostile manner and claiming that the rise of China constitutes a threat to the United States. Come on, China will continue to rise and you have to live with that fact. Now, on the other hand, the fact that Mr. Burns reveals that the United States is doubling the size of the China operation within the CIA, allocating more funds, hiring more people, is either a bluffing or an open challenge to China. And this will only strengthen China's confidence and the resources to deal with these espionage activities launched by the United States against China.
Benjamin, China is obviously getting the attention that other countries would envy. I mean, a China Mission Center, doubling the percentage of funding for the CIA, according to Mr. Burns. Does China really deserve this special treatment? And why announcing it to the world? Is it to alarm China? Obviously not. But what's the point of making it clear to the world that the U.S. is doing this and has been doing this over the past couple of years?
Well, it's clearly a threat. And if you read carefully in the article in Foreign Affairs, you can see that Burns, the CIA director, repeatedly refers to China as a so-called threat and the biggest so-called threat. Now, for me as an American, for many American people, this is ridiculous. The idea that China threatens us as people, like it's going to attack the U.S., is ridiculous. When they say threat, what they really mean is a so-called threat to the U.S.-dominated hegemonic order. And this is quite frustrating because the U.S. government constantly claims, at least the Biden administration claims, that it does not want a new Cold War. Instead, they refer to their policy as competition. But if you read carefully what Burns and other officials have said, they're using Cold War rhetoric. In fact, in his Foreign Affairs article, Burns says that the post-Cold War era ended with the war in Ukraine in 2022, and he refers to both Russia and China as a threat. So if you read between the lines, he's essentially saying that the U.S. is waging a new Cold War. It reminds me of this very aggressive rhetoric from Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, who also gave a speech in which he said that the U.S. goal is to shape the strategic environment around China. That is containment policy. So we see that the U.S. has not learned any of the lessons of the previous Cold War. It's engaged in this very aggressive kind of Cold War strategy. And if you read the article, he says very clearly that the U.S. also sees China as a so-called technological threat. And this is why the U.S. is waging a tech war on China. They talk about competition, but they actually don't want competition from Chinese technology companies.
Well,
and in his article, Burns cites important industries like quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and semiconductors, which the U.S. has targeted with unilateral sanctions.
Yeah, sure. Benjamin, let me interrupt you here. Jake Sullivan actually almost simultaneously was elaborating on the implementation of the U.S. strategy, namely the confront, compete, and cooperate diagram. Confront where they must, compete where they confront where they should, compete where they must, and cooperation when they could. I mean, people are getting confused. But at this time, he was just talking about how the Biden administration has stabilized the relationship with with China over the past year, and yet you are seeing this very hostile rhetoric, treating China as the largest, and they're among the same administration. Mr. Gao, do you think that reveals something about this administration? I mean, can it really work, and can China really react to this? You want me to cooperate with you, but on the other hand, you're doubling down and spying on me. How is China supposed to deal with this?
Well, first of all, Washington is talking the talk but walking a different walk. Secondly, when they talk about the 3 C's, they actually have only one thing in mind. That is to hold China down onto the ground as if there are no consequences. However, allow me to emphasize one point. According to a U.S. study, China's manufacturing output is more than the next 9 countries combined together. Therefore, I think this containment strategy by the United States against China will eventually end up in great failure, because China is here, China will stand firm, China will develop, and eventually the United States and China need to get along with each other, rather than Washington betting that they can hold China down. Now, this speech on an article by Mr. Burns on behalf of CIA is alarming to a certain extent, because espionage, which is practiced by almost all countries in the world, is supposed to be secretive and not to be, like laundry aired in the public. And this is extremely alarming, because they are really digging in very deeply in this Cold War mentality and try to hold China as the enemy of the United States, as the real rival of the United States, whereas the reality is just the opposite. China is perfectly happy to live peacefully with the United States.
Yeah, let's talk about this counter-espionage law that was very much exposed in the international mainstream media. The law that China enacted, which took effect on July the 1st last year. China says it was to strengthen national security. However, when you look at some of the Western media reports, it was used as a tool for geopolitical confrontation with the U.S. or targeting international investments or business people operating in China. Benjamin, looking back, do you think China did the right thing? I mean, are China's concern with national security actually warranted?
Absolutely. And it's not just China. Many countries around the world have implemented similar national security laws. Ironically, the U.S. has very strict national security laws, but when other countries implement similar legislation, the U.S. accuses them of being authoritarian, supposedly. Well, if they're authoritarian, then the U.S. has been authoritarian for a very long time, especially since 9/11 and all of these very, Orwellian laws. You mentioned that term, Orwellian. The U.S. is the master in surveillance, and actually the U.S. surveils countries around the world, as we've seen through the reports of whistleblowers like Edward Snowden. But back on the subject of China and national security, this shows this double standard in which the United States tries to have its cake and eat it too. The U.S. boasts publicly that it's expanding its spying on China. It boasts that it's doubling its budget for CIA operations. And yet, if China responds to these public revelations by furthering increasing its security, then the U.S. says that they're supposedly being authoritarian. This is what the U.S. has done with many countries. It boasts of its ability to meddle in their internal affairs, and when those countries respond with their own sovereign policies to defend their national security, the U.S. attacks them. So once again, we see this very kind of hegemonic mentality. If the U.S. were not engaged in such aggressive policies, I agree, it would be a very real possibility to have mutual cooperation, win-win cooperation. That's what I, as an American person, want. That's what many people I know in the U.S. want. But unfortunately, the political class and some of these big corporate monopolies, they want competition because they see China, its economy, as a threat to their dominance of the world, and they don't believe in cooperation. They believe in a zero-sum game mentality.
That definitely makes it more difficult for the Chinese authority to try to work with the United States for mutual benefit. As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, China, in reaction to this report, has said that China will, as always, be vigilant and won't let the U.S. illegal practice have its way. Let's hope that China is not being hooked to overreact. But what I find interesting is in the same article, and I'm going to mention this very briefly because I have a limited amount of time left. In the same article, Mr. Burns also wrote about Ukraine. He says the key to success lies in preserving Western aid for Ukraine. At less than 5% the U.S. defense budget, it is relatively modest investment with significant geopolitical returns for the United States and notable returns for American industry. Victor, how do you look at the CIA director talking about, notable returns for American industry and geopolitical gains for the United States with a modest investment in Ukraine aid here?
Well, whatever return that Mr. Burns is talking about to the United States, in many respects of the word, is at the huge cost of civilian lives suffered in Ukraine. I think the only right thing is to achieve ceasefire as quickly as possible to bring this war to an end, and through peace and diplomacy to preserve the sovereignty of Ukraine as a member state of the United Nations. That's the only right thing. I think CIA should get out of this big scam of urging the Ukrainian people to fight to the last Ukrainian without sacrificing any American life, and also for the defense industry to make huge amount of money out of this war in Ukraine. It is time to bring this war to an end as quickly as possible.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Many thanks to my guest Benjamin Norton, Editor-in-Chief of Geopolitical Economy Report, and Victor Gao, Chair Professor with Suzhou University. With that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Li Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. We've got The Point.